Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Gio and Joey Show. We've been off for a couple of weeks. Joey, was in camp meeting preaching to 10 to 13-year-olds 2 times a day. Well, once on Sunday, twice on Monday, twice on Tuesday, twice on Wednesday, twice on Thursday, twice on Friday, twice on Sabbath, and it ended Sunday morning. And so that was hectic, but it's been good. How you been? What you been doing with your time off?
Well, last week I was also at camp meeting. I was not preaching though. I was just an attender. But yeah, I was at Michigan camp meeting this last week.
Okay. So we got a good topic. It's something sometimes people don't think about or they take it for granted. Religious liberty. Why did you want to talk about it tonight?
Yeah, I just think it's important sometimes to get back to the roots of why we do something, right? Like, because I think sometimes it's easy for anything to drift. Well, let's take, the health message, right? I think Adventists have historically believed in the health message because, we want to make people's lives better, but ultimately, right, while we're helping people in the physical sense, we're ultimately to be pointing them to spiritual healing, right? And like that's when the health message is working properly, that is linked. And yet sometimes, right, there's a tendency, especially as big institutions get built up, hospitals and whatever, that it just becomes about the business, right? And it's
Hmm.
disconnected from the spiritual, right? And I think the same thing is true as religious liberty, right? I feel like there's a danger, right, as Adventists, right? So we have this heritage of defending religious liberty, but I think sometimes in the way Adventists talk about it, it winds up becoming like internally focused, like we want our rights. And don't get me wrong, I'm grateful to live in a country that still recognizes that I have religious liberty rights.
Hmm.
But the main reason I advocate for religious liberty is because I'm telling people something like I'm starting the conversation by telling people something about the God that I serve, right? So if I'm defending the religious liberty of my Sikh neighbor or my Jewish neighbor or my Muslim or atheist neighbor, I'm starting the conversation by telling them, listen, yeah, I want you to know Jesus, but the God that I serve will never force you to serve him, right?
Hmm.
And neither will I, right? And so it's in when it's seen in that way, it's a beautiful wedge for the gospel. It takes the pressure off.
So let me push back, right, from things we hear. What do you say to people though who say, but man, it's these other religions that are undermining the things that the liberties we have here in America. Specifically, right? We talk about Islam, right? How many people yell back it's incompatible with the West, and in many ways it is. But why is it important to defend even their religious liberty?
Well, because it's not the government's job to be making um, theological pronouncements, right? Like we can have a conversation about immigration, and that's separate. But I think the reality is, for Christians, there are people living in this country today, and as Christians, we are called to love them, right? We are called to advocate for them because that's what our God does.
Yeah, okay. So look, for me, the reason we started this show, and many may not know, is because of liberty of conscience. And to me, that's what the Bible is all about. Ultimately, God has granted every created creature a certain amount of freedom, right? Freedom to worship, freedom not to worship God. And and when we undermine anybody's liberty of conscience, then we become more reflectors of Satan's character than we are God's character. God never coerces, God never forces, God never um, forces someone against their will. And this is why, for example, in the book of Romans, Romans chapter 1, there's a sequence that it shows that when people rebel against God, there's a threefold sequence in Romans chapter 1 where he says, and then God gave them up. Because God's not going to force you to stay if you don't want God. And some people see that as required for true liberty, for true love to flourish. Your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think that's completely right. And I think it's important to this whole general narrative of the great controversy between Christ and Satan, in that what God is ultimately seeking to do, and I always forget the verse, but it's in the Old Testament, it's one of the prophets, where it says, sin will not rise up a second time.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
think that's really important, right? Like, religious liberty is part of how God is going to make sure that the sin problem doesn't rise up again, right? Because he's allowing everyone right now to make a choice and to decide to follow him or decide not to, right? Before he comes again, there will be no question in anybody's mind at the end, right? Where the two systems, right, between Christ and Satan's lead, right? Whereas, I mean, technically he's all powerful and whatever. Like, technically he would have even been justified, right? He could have, when Lucifer and the third of the angels fell, he could have just zapped them right then.
Hmm.
But then there would have forever been questions, right, in the minds of his creation as well, was this, was Lucifer really right? Did he have a point?
Yeah.
So in his
I,
wisdom, God allowed the system to play out so people can see.
yeah, and I want to go deeper in that because a lot of times people don't understand that. So to illustrate it, I usually use this example. Uh, Imagine me as the pastor get accused by the church treasurer that I've been stealing funds from the church, and that the treasurer is going to reveal that evidence the next day. Well, the next day comes and she is found murdered. Who is suspect number one? It's going to be me, the person who got accused. And so it was the same way in the Bible. When you study the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, you gather enough evidence that Satan is undermining or trying to undermine the character of God, that he can run the government better, that God doesn't really care for his angels and his creation. If God would destroy Satan right away, then those questions, as you pointed out, will continue to linger, and people will then worship God out of fear. And so, God, in his providence and obviously in his wisdom, how do you fight an accusation against yourself? You can't use force against an accusation against your character. What you have to do is give enough time for your character to be revealed. And ultimately, God's character was revealed on the cross, where he's willing to empty himself for us, whereas Lucifer, right, is about exalting himself and trying to undermine God and liberty of conscience. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And then I would go further that, right, Christ, so obviously the fullest manifestation of who God was in Christ, right, who is God. But then, right, God has always had a people, right, that are supposed to also represent him, right, by him living out in their
Mm-hmm.
lives. And obviously, throughout the history of the Christian church, right, some of the biggest people to cast doubt on his name have been Christians, have been the church by the way it's behaved. And so I think it's important that the church, that Christians are the loudest voices in defense of religious liberty, right? Because obviously there's going to be Christians that are, well, Christians that are on the other side. And so it's important that we make the case, right, that when we're defending religious liberty, that we don't just defend it in secular terms, but that we make the case that this is about who God is, and that God is not, for lack of a better term, God is not a cosmic rapist, right? He doesn't
Mm-hmm.
force your love. Because what is forced love? Right? What do we call that? We call that rape, right?
Yeah.
And so God is not going to force us to love him, right? For one, that's oxymoronic, right? You can't, if it's forced, it's not love, right? Like if you're a husband and you have a wife and she only stays with you because she's afraid of what you're going to do to her if she tries to leave, well,
Mm-hmm.
she doesn't love you. She's just terrified of you. And so God doesn't want that. God wants a love relationship with his creatures. And so for that, he can't force them.
And I want to get
What
into
do you
some
think?
practical, modern political examples and talk. But before we do that, I want to go through a quick dive of certain stories in the Bible, right? You begin in Genesis right there, right? There's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they are told that they should not eat of it. They can eat of all the trees in the garden. There was just one area that was forbidden from them to eat of. And there you see God could have made a garden with no choice. In essence, where they were forced to stay with him. But he gave them a choice of who they wanted to worship. And that's the key word. Ultimately, it boils down to worship. And then obviously, if you fast forward, this is a quick fast forward, but the whole story of the nation of Israel is, whom are you going to worship, right? Who are you going to freely choose? And Joseph, obviously, Joshua with the famous line, right? But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And Moses, in his farewell address, I put life and death before you. Choose life that you may live. And ultimately, the cross of Jesus Christ is, right? For God so loved the world that whosoever will believe in him will not perish. Choice, time after time. And then you fast forward. Like I said, this is a quick fast forward. You get to Revelation 13, where the mark of the beast. Either you worship the beast and receive his mark, or you don't and are threatened with death. Once again, it boils down to choice. And God allows people to make choices because ultimately, love cannot flourish unless it is freely given and bestowed. And so ultimately, at the heart of the battle between good and evil is, whom are you going to worship? It's a choice. And we, by the grace of God, Joey and I, and those of I don't want to say our denomination, those who are sincerely following Christ, do so because they love him. And why do we love him? Because he first loved us. Now you are strong in the political area. How do we see that liberty of conscience being threatened in politics today and within the Christian church?
Well, obviously, the obvious one that everybody's going to mention, right, is the growing Christian nationalism movement and whatever. But I actually think most of the threats that we've seen have come is that we've started to have a less tolerant culture, right? So, if John Adams and the founders, right, they all talked about, right, like, yes, the government protecting liberty and statute is good and necessary and important, but
Mm-hmm.
that will only last so long if the culture is against it, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
if people want speech codes or religious codes, eventually the Constitution can give way, right? Because ultimately, right, the people are going to decide, we don't want to be tolerant. And we've seen obviously intolerance before, whether it's Colorado coming after, uh, um, just
The
forgot his
baker.
name, but the masterpiece
Mm-hmm.
cake shop guy. Um, and stuff like that, or the web designer, right, being forced to create, websites for things they don't believe in. Um, but one thing that I do think it's important because sometimes when I see our religious liberty events, it's all doom and gloom, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that matches the lived reality of anyone in America, like Christian was,
Yeah.
right? In other words, listen, you and I both just got back from
From camp
open
meetings.
Adventist camp meetings, which were advertised online and on social media. Can I ask, did any police come to try to shut you down while you were
No,
while you
no,
were
no, of
preaching?
course not.
No.
Mm-hmm.
And same with ours, right? And so, like, we know that in the final crisis, right, we'll lose religious liberty. But sometimes in the way we talk about it, you'd think we were living in Nigeria, right, where our brothers and sisters are actually facing persecution. And yet, I think, especially as we're looking at the upcoming 250th, we have a lot as American Christians that we should be grateful for, and we should be seeking, sorry, we should be seeking to try to preserve liberty of conscience. All right.
While you clear your throat, you brought up Nigeria, and I was visiting a different church this weekend, and I asked a couple of the people because they're from Kenya. It was a Kenyan church predominantly, and I asked a couple of people there, and they were completely unaware of what's happening in Nigeria. Now, some did, so I don't want to say none did, but explain to people what exactly is happening in Nigeria to Christians of many faiths?
Yeah, so basically, northern Nigeria is basically controlled by various Islamic factions, right? Now, most of the trouble is created by groups like Boko Haram,
Hmm.
ISIS, Al Qaeda, right? They're causing most of the trouble, but their preachers and stuff are riling up young Muslim men that are in like Fulani or Hausa, like these are tribal designations, but these are Islamic tribal peoples, nomadic peoples. And generally speaking, in the rest of the country, there's kind of been like Christian communities and these nomadic Islamic communities have gotten along. But in recent years, as Boko Haram, Al Qaeda, and ISIS preachers, they've been kind of influencing, like even though these Fulani aren't members of these groups, they've kind of been
Hmm.
influencing particularly the men. And so, like my buddy Eric, who was on this podcast, um, where he lives, it's mostly Fulani Muslims, and he's actually been able to establish good relationships with those that are in his community. But not far from where he was on Palm Sunday, and I think the person may have been from out of town, but somebody came by and shot up a house full of Christians, just shot into it, and I think killed like 29 people. And that kind of thing, is happening more and more, particularly in northern Nigeria, but it's starting to, affect lower parts of the country as well. And that
Yeah.
Nigeria is just one. Christians throughout the Middle East and North Africa are facing severe persecution.
So here's something I just Googled real quick, and it talks about Nigerian Christian persecution, and you just Google it, to those listening, and you see that this is happening, and we have to be able to, as Christians here in the United States, try to do something about it. Call your congressman or write a letter and ask them to speak up for it. Now, to his credit, the president has had several targeted attacks, destroying some of these groups that are attacking Christians. But let me ask you this question, because we were talking or alluded to it prior to coming on live. Why is why would you say, or better yet, let me back it up. What do you think of the spirituality of the Nigerian Christians who are suffering persecution?
Oh, I mean, these people are far more dedicated to the faith than anything we typically see. I don't care if it's Adventist, I don't care if it's Baptist, I don't care if it's Catholic. In America, we just don't see the kind, like how many, and obviously, I think when persecution comes, God will be refining the people even here, but it's something we need to be on our knees about, and we need to be,
Hmm.
I think remembering and reading about and learning about what our brothers and sisters in Nigeria and elsewhere go through, I think is part of how we start developing a faith like theirs. But how many people in your local church, if a one call went, or like not a one call, but if a news alert went out and it said, you know, near Oklahoma, in all the churches near Oklahoma City, except Adventist churches, right? There's going to be three gunmen, and they're going to be randomly stopping into the Adventist churches around Oklahoma City, right, looking
Hmm.
for Adventists to kill. How full would your church be that Sabbath? Right? If people
Yeah.
knew, like, hey,
Hmm.
there's going in the churches around us, it wouldn't be very full. And yet, these Christians, and obviously majority are Sunday keeping, but our Adventist brothers and
Hmm.
sisters there too. Saturday and Sunday, the churches are full, right? They know, right, throughout the country, they know what could happen to them, and yet they still show up and they go to church and they worship God. I don't even think most American Christians, like knowing that persecution could come that day, I don't think most of us would come, and yet they do. And I just think that's something that we should ponder.
And that's where I love this quote where it says, the church is never at its purest. So think about that, right? When is the church its purest? And the quote goes on to say, the church is never at its purest until it suffers persecution. Why is that? Tying it back to what we've been talking and opening the show about liberty of conscience, right? Because those who choose to stay despite the persecution, do so because they know Jesus and do not want to deny him out of their free choice, right? If people leave the church because of persecution, then it shows you that they were never truly in love with God to begin with, right? And so even in persecution, liberty of conscience is preserved. Even in persecution, freedom of religion is preserved, right? Because people are choosing to worship God regardless of the consequences, which is why I like a verse, one of my favorite verses from the book of Revelation, but it's specifically chapter 12, verse 11 is, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and loved not their lives even when faced with death, right? So they're faced with death and they overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. In other words, they're willing to testify even with their own life because of the blood of the Lamb that they're not going to give up on God. And ultimately, to have that kind of willpower or that kind of grace upon your life, it's because you're truly surrendered to Jesus Christ, because Christ is really working in you. And if that is the case, then you should want that kind of freedom for everybody else.
Something you said there that triggered something in me, right? So not triggered in a bad way, but
Yeah,
you
yeah.
said right? You said that even under persecution, religious freedom remains, and that's
Mm-hmm.
a really good right? Religious freedom, because God's government, God's kingdom is not of this world, but it's it's above, right, the
Mm-hmm.
kingdoms of this world. And God's kingdom, right, which sets the normative moral standards, has religious freedom, right? So religious freedom naturally exists, right, because
Mm-hmm.
that's the way God made the world. And so if local governments aren't like in other words, how local governments or whatever, right? Like right now, America recognizes religious liberty, but someday when it doesn't, all that will say is that the government of America has ceased to be a just government, right? That recognizes our natural liberties. But our liberty will ultimately still exist under God's kingdom, right? And God will still never force us, right? And so if the government does, right, we still have that ultimate freedom in God. And I don't know, I just think that's something, again, I think it's important that we do more of our religious liberty seminars if we talk about the theological basis for religious liberty, right? I just think that's so important. And I'll just go to a quote, something that Mrs. White actually talked about, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
she actually said that our presentation of religious liberty should never be disconnected from the presentation of our broader message because it's all a part, right? So we defend religious liberty and liberty of conscience because of what we believe about God, about the great controversy, about his character. I mean, that's everything for Adventists, right? The character of God, that's the
Mm-hmm.
whole, right? Like, yes, all like the state of the dead, right? The health message, right? Hell, right? The sanctuary. Like these are all doctrinal truths, right? And we can,
Mm-hmm.
proof text them and all that stuff, and that's good. But at the end of the day, if we're just having them as standalone doctrines, they're not going to do anybody any good. But we tie them all together. What does it say? It says, well, God is not going to torture anybody in hell for all of eternity. Right?
Mm-hmm.
He's a God of love. God, He's just, right? God, He wants to dwell with us, right? Like when all of the pieces are together, right, we can lift up before the people. Ultimately, we're lifting up Christ, right? We're lifting up the character of God. And so I think religious liberty, it's really important that we're fitting it into that broader picture, right? Like
Yeah,
as
the
as
broader
one
umbrella.
that
Going
fleshes
back to
out.
Revelation 13, right? That final crisis there described. It boils down to choice, right? You're either going to worship the beast or you're going to worship God. You're going to receive the mark or you're not. And you see that it's a religious persecution, right? Because it boils down to worship. And this is a quote that we have shared in the past, and you see it here. It's from Ben Franklin, right? He says, when a religion is good, I conceive it will support itself. And when it does not support itself, and God does not take care to support it, so that its professors are obliged to call for help of the civil power, 'tis a sign I apprehend of its being a bad one. Why? Because ultimately, even if we're persecuted and it seems like God has forsaken us, which he hasn't, right? Ultimate freedom is trusting in God, not the sword of the state, right? You can throw me in jail. As a matter of fact, forget using that example. I go to the Bible. In Acts chapter 26, Paul is brought, and it's a sermon I preach called, it's based on something the Bible says, but not in Acts 26. It's called Ambassador in Chains, right? Because ultimately, you and I are not citizens of this world. We're citizens of heaven, and we are ambassadors. And ambassadors do the work of the leader who sends them. Right? So Paul is brought before Agrippa, and he's told to give his testimony. He shares his testimony. And Agrippa says these famous, sad words: "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." But when you read the chapter and you really understand it, even you have all these affluent people: Agrippa, Bernice, Festus, Felix, I think was there, or Felix or Festus, one of them. They're all there in pomps and circumstances. And yet the only one that was truly free was the one in chains. Why? Because ultimately freedom doesn't come from the government. Freedom comes from God. And you could be in prison, dying for your faith, knowing that you have overcome the greatest prison ever, which is sin, by the blood of the Lamb. So that's why religious liberty is so important. And any group, and I've shared this before, and I'll let you chime in here. I was having a conversation with a Christian nationalist, somebody that we are friends with on Twitter. And ultimately I asked them, would you be comfortable with X religion, being the ones passing the laws, or Catholics or Baptists or Presbyterians or Reformed? And his response saddened me, because he says, I don't care who it is, as long as it's Christian. And that's a wrong attitude to have. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I just think what's been lost is it is Christianity that in many ways shaped. Now, obviously, there were Jews right there at the founding, there were
Mm,
others, but Christianity, right? One of the a book I just ordered, and I'm looking forward to really reading, is it's the Sermons of Liberty, or the Sermons of the Revolution, right? During the Revolutionary War, or the build up to the Revolutionary War, right? The preachers were preaching liberty, right? Liberty of conscience, these things, right? And the American Revolution kind of came out of this context, right? Of, well, first there had been the First Great Awakening, right? You read the quote from Ben Franklin, and Ben Franklin's always lifted up as like the arch example of like
mm-hmm,
a deist who wasn't an Orthodox Christian and all these things. And I think the history is a little bit more murky on that. But one of Ben Franklin's best friends was George Whitefield, right? Like the two of these guys were incredibly close friends. And
mm-hmm,
especially towards the end of his life, Ben Franklin was saying things like, like very evangelical-ish, right? And yet, and the reason I point that out is because, or the other one, right? People say, well, George Washington, he wasn't really a Christian, he was a deist. It's like, well, George Washington was, no, I'm not saying how orthodox he was on everything, but I can tell you for a fact he was not a deist. Because
mm-hmm.
what's the key characteristic of deists? Well, you believe in the watchmaker God, right? You
Yeah.
don't believe in prophet.
Mm-hmm,
Well, I challenge you, right? Like, find me a George Washington speech that doesn't refer to providence, that doesn't ask for providence,
mm-hmm,
that doesn't talk about providence's hand in leading the nation, right? And so the thing that I would say to my Christian nationalist friends is you're actually, in a sense, you're not actually understanding the real way in which Christianity influenced America, is that these were Christians who wanted liberty, and they
mm-hmm,
wanted it for themselves, and they extended it to others. Now, obviously, we know in the colonial period that did not happen,
mm-hmm,
but ultimately, what went out at the constitutional convention was the Madisons, the Franklins, the Jeffersons, right, who said, no, 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 the state does not have a role in electing pontiffs, right, and
Mm-hmm.
selecting pastors, right? Like the state, its role in regard to religion is to make sure that all religions are treated equally and freely under our Constitution.
Ultimately, when we try to use the state, like we will see in Revelation chapter 13, when you try to use the state in the name of Christianity, what you are unwittingly doing is revealing your lack of faith in God, because you think that you have to wield the sword. You think you have to force the issue. And God never forces. You think of the rich young ruler. Jesus himself, God, standing face to face with him, appealed to him to surrender. But the rich young ruler decided not to, and God let him walk away, right? God didn't grab him by the arm and said, "No, you're going to follow me," right? Even Nebuchadnezzar, even Nicodemus, who felt attraction to Jesus in John chapter 3, Jesus didn't force him to follow him. It wasn't until 3.5 years later that Nicodemus made that choice for himself. So when we try to use the sword, we're basically, and what we're basically doing is telling God, I'm Judas and I know better how your story has to end.
Hmm.
You're no better than Judas then in the end, right? Who tried to force God into doing something that Judas thought was best. Ultimately, my loyalty, as much as I love this country, is not to this country, it's to God. And so if saving America is not in the will of God, then I would rather see the nation die and be in God's will. Because if you're in God's will, then wherever you are, you're going to flourish. And listen to this, even if you're killed. Because woe to the man who seeks to save his life, he will lose it. But he who loses his life for God's sake will save it. Now, ultimately, in our understanding of prophecy, America is going to be here until the end. Nevertheless, though, she's going to repudiate the principles of her Constitution. And it's not that Constitution is wrong, is that people will no longer feel compelled to abide by it. And that's when we get the issues of Revelation 13.
Yeah. And as we think about that time, right, like, or, as we think about our Christian brothers and sisters in Nigeria and other places are already in this place. And as we think about
Mm-hmm.
a time when we may be in this place, or we know we will, I think it's good to dwell on the story of the three Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and
Mm-hmm.
Abednego. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were they loyal to Babylon in the sense that did they
Yes.
serve the king
Yes.
well? Did they give him good advice, right? Did they fulfill their duties well? And yet, on the plane of Dura, when he then makes an unjust law that says, you bow down to this image of me, right, or get thrown in the fiery furnace, they refuse. And they're not the only three Hebrews on the plane,
Mm-hmm.
but they're the only three that stand firm, right, for Jehovah. And when he brings them before him, actually, this goes to show how loyal they actually were. It is that the king, even now, doesn't want to destroy them. He sees like these
Mm-hmm.
are like loyal people. So he brings them before him and he gives them another chance. And he's like, hey, listen, you know, when you hear the sound of the music, bow down. And they said, oh, king, we will not bow down. They said, the God that we serve is able to deliver us from your hand. But even if he does not, we will not bow down to your golden statue or the
Mm-hmm.
idol that you have set up. And so I think that's important, right? We should be loyal citizens. We should be good citizens. We should seek the welfare of our city, right? We should vote our conscience, right? We should do all these things. We should be good citizens. But at the end of the day, right? And this comes down to the religious liberty question. We need to exercise our liberty for the higher kingdom over, right? Any
Earthly
any
kingdom.
any secondary kingdoms.
And that brings me back to we've explained it in the past, but it's always good to review our understanding of what we call the two tablet theory, right? There are 10 commandments, and you would think, right, 10 divided by 2 would be 5, right? And many people are under the assumption that the 10 commandments are divided 5 on each tablet. But the reality, they're not. They're divided 4 on one tablet, 6 on the other. Why? Because the first 4 deal with our relationship with God, in which these 3 Jewish boys understood that Nebuchadnezzar had no right to impose a law on it, right? You shall have no other gods before me, right? Do not make any graven images. Do not bear false witness. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. And remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, the seventh day Sabbath. And so those first 4 are my relationship with God. No earthly government, no spouse, no child, no parent has a right to interfere with those first 4. However, Romans 13 tells us about the last 6, which are my relationship with my brothers and sisters, right? Whether they are believers or not. And when we separate that, we see the role of government. We can make laws about children. We can make laws about murder and coveting and adultery. But once we cross that line into forcing worship, thinking that we must make this a Christian nation by force, then we've crossed into a territory that does not belong to us. And before I throw it back to Joey, I like to say this. I want everybody in the United States of America to be converted to Christianity. What I will not do is use force to do so. I want everybody to become Christian by persuasion and by conviction of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, and the two tablet theory is really good, particularly for making the case biblically, especially when you show them Romans 13, that shows the duties of the state being just in the second tablet, to make the case to our fellow Christians, right, that this is, as statesmen, we can go this far and no further. But the way to explain it to your non-Christian friends is
Mhm.
simply this, right? Right, whether they accept Christianity or Judaism or anything like that or not, right? The moral law, right? So for us, right, it comes in two categories. There are those things that are evident by reason alone, right, human reason alone, and there are those things that are only evident through revelation,
Mhm.
right? And whether you're Christian or not, you can understand those things that are accessible to reason, right? You can understand reasonably why parental rights are important, or why you shouldn't murder, or why you shouldn't steal, right? You can understand these things. You can understand that human beings have this that you or that me or a black person or a white person, right? Like you can understand that between all of us, we share a common human nature, right? We can
Mhm.
understand that from reason. And so the government now has an obligation to, enforce parental rights or, enforce against murder or enforce against theft or, yes, make sure that human beings are treated equally. These are things that fall within the realm of the government because these are things that everyone, any human being, right, that shares the nature of a human being can come to just by reason. Whereas those things, like, you know, without the Bible, like
Mhm.
maybe you can get the idea that we need rest. You could come up with that reason. But are you gonna, without revealed revelation, are you gonna come to Saturday instead of Sunday or Sunday
Mhm.
instead of Thursday? You're not. You
No.
need
No.
like revelation is what says that. And so that's that's outside of the sphere of the government and the civil authority.
Yeah, and no doubt. And that's why, you know, we understand, or at least society, as you were alluding to, can quickly be like, hey, I don't want to be murdered and you shouldn't murder my family. Hey, I don't want my property stolen. And I won't steal your property. I don't want, you sleeping with my wife. I won't sleep with your wife, right? Those are things that are natural, and those are the things we can govern. Going back, we've been alluding to Revelation 13, but I want to get us to Revelation 14. showing more of this religious liberty as well. Right, because you get to Revelation 14 and it says, "Then I saw another angel um, flying in the midst of heaven." So, right, having the everlasting gospel. And I love that phrase right there, right? Because what kind of gospel is this?
Everlasting.
Right? Everlasting gospel. Because sometimes Adventists get accused that we preach the three angels' message. Well, yeah, we do preach the three angels' message. But what is the three angels' message but the everlasting gospel for the end times, right? And so it's an everlasting gospel. It continues to say this, ready? To preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. And I bring that up, and I'm not going to go into a biblical theological discussion on springs of water and all that and its allusion to the Sabbath. But the point is, God is coming back, and this everlasting gospel message doesn't force anybody. It's an invitation to worship the creator of the world. Even in the last days, God is still offering people a choice. And yet it is arrogant of man, and we've seen it through history, right? The medieval church persecuting people. Protestants who didn't know better in Europe and early America persecuting people for believing differently. We see in the French Revolution persecuting Christians, right? Because they believed in God and they were atheists. Anytime you try to force the conscience of someone else by the use of the sword, it's never good for society. And the only ones that come out on top are those who overcome by the blood of the Lamb and trust God with their life and not looking for tick for tat. And anytime you see a union of church and state, it never goes well for that nation, let alone that particular church or those particular individuals. What are some other examples in history of this colossal mistake?
Well, it's not Christianity,
Mm,
but right now, the Islamic Republic of Iran, what is the
yes.
least popular what is the least popular religion among young people in Iran? It's Islam,
Mm-hmm.
because they've grown up under this oppressive Islamic government, and they want nothing to do with, Islam, right? And evangelical Christianity, which is persecuted in Iran, is growing by leaps and bounds,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I just think, to my Christian nationalist friends, I'm like, be careful what you wish for, right? Like if you force people's hand, they're not going to want anything to do with the religion that you
Mm,
preach. They may go along to save their life or to avoid a fine, but
mm-hmm.
they're in their heart of hearts, they're not serving Jesus. And so I think it's important to remember that.
Mm.
Obviously, but yeah, you said throughout history. I mean, there's so many examples, right? On the atheistic side, right? Communism was
Yeah.
enforcing
China,
the
Mao.
China and Mao. Um, Today in China, right, the true Christians. So this is another thing. Sometimes the state will allow you to have your faith if you're willing to make it official and register with the government and go along with them. So in China, there will be the actual Catholic Church, right? Like the official one, or the official Baptist Church, or the official Adventist Church, where the leaders have registered with the government and they've agreed, we'll send our kids to take their tests on Saturday. We won't cause trouble. And then you have underground
The
Catholics and underground Baptists and underground Adventists who basically say, no, that's too much of a compromise, right? We
mm-hmm.
can't serve, we can't subordinate our faith to the state in these matters. And so they go underground and they're persecuted. So it looks, on the surface, it looks like, oh, all these Christian groups, they have churches and they're meeting, and China's fine. But the real Christians and all these denominations are underground.
Yeah, and we saw it prophetically speaking, where the Bible talks about the Dark Ages, right? Or the 1260 years that the church was in sackcloth and and witnessing, right? In Revelation chapter 10, where the church was dominated by the Roman Catholic Church, and the Bible was only in Latin, and the lay person didn't have the Bible. And then praise God for the Reformation, which was prophesied, right? The Great Awakening, the fact that the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation would be understood further, the book would be unsealed, and then I like how C.D. Brooks says it. When you look at the nations without Christianity, you begin to realize that Christ is needed after all. How many people are flocking to move to Islamic-led countries, right? They go to places where Christianity flourishes because people long for freedom. Unfortunately, sometimes they go with the wrong intentions to subvert that Christianity. And look, and I'm not saying religious liberty means you have to be a doormat, but we don't fight back the way the world does. We fight back trusting in God, as you said earlier, as good citizens, voting our conscience and by persuasion and trusting that God knows best. And to my Christian nationalists, as you said, be careful what you wish for, because Revelation 13 is there as a stark reminder that one day, well, as a matter of fact, the Gospels say there will come a time where they will kill you thinking they're doing the work of God. And that is sad. That's how far sin gets you. And it's not the atheists in Revelation or in the Gospels that persecutes. It's people like the Pharisees who thought they knew better. People like Judas who they thought they knew better than God end up fighting against God themselves.
Mm. Yeah, I guess
We got to
maybe this
wrap
is
up
like
here.
my
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna say this will be my last statement. This will be my closing appeal to everybody.
Hmm.
To follow my advice that I listed before, that our proclamation of religious liberty should never be disconnected from our broader message. So anybody watching that's felt their heart ticked, right? Like, let me tell you about the God who, listen, he created you, right? And then like he bought like, you were his in creation, and then he sent his son to buy you back through redemption, right? And he will never violate your choice, right? Like
Hmm.
this God, right? Like he's like um if he's like the young suitor, right, who pursues the woman, right, with gentlemanly acts, but he'll never cross stop being a gentleman, right? He'll never force, right? So this guy that wants a relationship with you, right, like put your faith in that God, right? That's what it says. Like, in other words, he'll never force you, so it's safe to get to know him, right? And,
Hmm.
and I've just been thinking about that. Like, if there's a God who doesn't exist, right? He does not exist. But if he wanted to force you, right? If you get too close, whatever, like he's going to grab you in and like put you in a cult, right? Like, well, then it would not be safe to get to know that God. But the
Hmm.
God of the Bible, right? Jesus Christ, right? Who died to give you a choice, you can come and get to know him. Like, you're not sure about the whole religious thing, maybe you've been burned by Christians or whatever. Well, come close, come near to Jesus. He'll never grab you. He'll never force you in, but I think as you get to know him, yeah, you'll want to serve him. So that's my appeal. Get close to this God. It's safe.
Amen. Amen for that. And I'll close with this. Throughout Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation, it's all about a choice. And I'll end with the most well known verse: For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever will believe in him will not perish but have everlasting life. The choice is yours. He's calling you. Jesus did not come into the world to condemn the world, but that the world may be saved through him. This planet is a ticking time bomb. It will be destroyed. And God is giving us a way out through his Son. As for me and Joey, we've accepted that gift by His grace, by His love. We have seen and surrendered to the soon coming King. May you do so also. Until next time on the Gio and Joey Show, be blessed.